So today on the podcast, we will take a look at a new book about the creation of Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room, a book called Before the Birds Sang Words by Ken Bruce. And for regular listeners, you already know that we have a unique format on our episodes about books. First, as always, I will read you a chapter from the book itself so that you can fall into the details, hear the rhythm and flow of the narrative, and observe how the author uses language. I also do this so that you will have a better sense of the author's overall project and vision, which is something that you can't simply get from a discussion of the book itself. And then next we'll bring in the author for a short discussion. I like this book for a number of reasons. First, because it looks deeply at both the history of the attraction and also how the attraction was shaped by American art and popular culture. In Disney circles, we often look at the history of an attraction as though it was simply a vision that was dreamed up inside of WED or WDI. But more accurately, attraction development is often a silent discussion between designers and trends in Western culture. This book nails that, how trends in Tiki and Polynesian culture of the late 1950s and early 1960s give rise to Walt's interest in an island-themed show. Second, the author had access to a wide range of documents and expertly weaves this material together into an interesting story. Third, there are details in this book that I've not seen anywhere before. And lastly, this book isn't just the story of the Tiki Room. It's the story of Walt's design process in the early 1960s, or to put that another way. Though this book is focused on the subject of the Tiki Room, the author uses that topic smartly to tell a much larger story. Okay, so we have a longer episode today, so if you're ready, let's go. The chapter that I'm going to read today is chapter 22. The book itself has 27 chapters, but I felt that this chapter was a good standalone entry for our listeners, which focuses on a late period of script development for the attraction. But there are a couple of things you may need to know before going in. For much of its early development, the Tiki Room was imagined as a restaurant where guests would enjoy a meal for about 30 minutes, and then during dessert and coffee, the birds, flowers, and tikis would come to life. This concept stayed with the show for months during its development. And if you've ever poked around in the Disneyland version of the Tiki Room, you'd find that some furnishings still there were initially designed for restaurant use, though now they're cleverly disguised. Also, you need to know a couple of historical figures who are introduced earlier in the book. The first is John Hench, who was not only one of the key designers of the Tiki Room, but also tasked with taking a course to better understand restaurant operations so those concepts could be worked into Walt's park. The next is Vern Stouffer of Stouffer's. Though Stouffer's today is primarily known for frozen foods, in the 1960s, Stouffer's also operated a line of specialty restaurants. Disney had invited Stouffer's into the park to manage 2 of its restaurants, and they were also working with Stouffer's to revamp food service at a little-known Disney-owned venue in Denver called Celebrity Sports Center, but that's another story. But Walt and Vern Stouffer didn't really get along. Somewhere here in a file drawer, I have a set of photos of Vern and Walt scowling at each other shot after shot at the Tahitian Terrace. And lastly is Wally Bogue, who in this chapter is simply Wally. He was the comedic star of the Golden Horseshoe Revue at Disneyland, who later worked on scripts with Walt, appeared in Disney films, and was the primary writer for the Tiki Room, and also voiced Jose, the lead macaw. So, if you have all those things in mind, I think you have everything you need to enjoy the chapter that lies ahead. So let's jump into Ken Bruce's excellent book. Words Sang Words, Chapter 22, Let's Put on the Show. On an early fall morning in 1962, Walt made a visit to the Tiki Room mock-up on Stage 3 to check in on the show's progress, yet another in a series of rehearsal run-throughs he'd participate in as the show evolved. Despite the restaurant's debut, now months behind schedule, it was clear to most that Walt was excited and energized by how the show was coming together. After this particular playback, however, Walt remained unusually quiet. In time, he turned to John Hench. "If we get rid of the tables, how many more people can we get in here?" Walt asked. John was taken off guard. Take out the tables? What was Walt thinking? He'd only just procured the restaurant furniture, and removing it would constitute an enormous waste of money and resources. Despite his concerns, John dutifully eliminated them and rearranged the remaining chairs. By November, a new seating plan was released, and Walt had his answer. About 110 additional guests could now fit into the Tiki Room. The subtext of his initial inquiry now crystal clear. Though the why and how of it all seemed hazy, it was obvious that Walt was no longer interested in the Tiki Room as a restaurant. John quickly moved forward on Walt's bold request to shape-shift the dining experience into a singular show. But the order left him both baffled and a bit put off. He had already spent an entire year developing the space as a restaurant and undoubtedly felt a certain sense of pride and ownership in where it currently stood. It was his very own concept sketches that had triggered the Bird Cafe in the first place, and ever since he had enjoyed a key role in virtually every design choice that followed, with many assuming that he was the project's second in command behind Walt. To so dramatically change the course this late in the game left him both frustrated and demoralized. 3 decades later, he bemoaned, "You can't design a show for one operation and then make a change so radically." Walt disagreed. With every successive run-through came multiple realizations that made the choice even more inevitable, not the least of which was how difficult it was becoming to imagine patrons actually eating while the birds were going through their paces. Walt always knew his mechanical menagerie was going to be charming, but nobody, Walt concluded, was prepared for how spellbinding it was turning out to be. "This is too good for a restaurant," Walt told Rolly Crump, "because when people come in here, they'd never leave." Had guests lingered, staff wouldn't have time to set up for the next meal, thus affecting the restaurant's profitability. One particular realization centered on how frustrating the Stouffer's arrangement had been for Walt since they'd started running the Pavilion and Terrace restaurants just 4 months prior, with the Tiki Room next in line for their sponsorship the following year. It concerned a problem he was forced to tolerate with all the restaurant lessees at the park, but one that was particularly vexing when it came to Stouffer's. As the food service providers were essentially tenants, each of them found creative ways to bypass contractual agreements regarding hours of operation, in turn setting their own as they saw fit. Food service closures could be random, unannounced, and could go on for days, a problem that, John Hench observed, drove Walt crazy. And though we couldn't know anything about it, one day he called us all together and said, "You guys have to go out and find something about food. We've got to do it ourselves." It was a business plan Walt had fixated on for years. Stouffer's, however, wasn't just closing their doors at inappropriate times. They were also opening them for private company parties during off hours as well, a direct contractual violation that put an enormous burden on Disneyland's support staff. Writing to a friend, Walt grumbled, their method of operation just wasn't compatible to park procedures. Their local people had no authority. Everything had to come from Cleveland, and our people had no jurisdiction either. Finally, by turning the Tiki Room into a separate ticketed attraction, Walt would stand to make considerably more money on his investment if the show found an audience. Whereas peak summer restaurant viewings would have allowed upward of 900 guests per day, with an additional 200 or so if private parties were booked, food-free shows could comfortably accommodate over 8,000. The writing was on the wall. Still, running a profitable show without a corporate sponsor was a risky affair, so WED management quickly set up meetings with outside companies to gauge their interest in sponsoring the standalone attraction, such as C&H Sugar and RCA. The latter tempted with sketches of a courtyard garden, prominently and awkwardly featuring their new color televisions poking out of the foliage. Unfortunately, nothing came of the effort. Until a suitable partner was found, Walt would have to personally shoulder the cost of running the show. Once John Hench had finished rearranging the chairs inside the Tiki Room, Walt gave it a quick once-over and made his final decision. "That's what we're going to do," he told John. "I'll handle the man who was to operate the restaurant so we can make a show out of it." Now absent the limitations inherent in a restaurant arrangement, George Bruns returned to Stage A just 4 days after the amended Bird Room seating plan was released to record an additional number he felt crucial for a self-contained presentation. As Walt was anxious to explore more profitable strengths of an automated show, namely the ability to power through 3 performances every hour, it was imperative audiences left the theater in a brisk, orderly manner. To facilitate their speedy removal, George turned to a musical genre closely associated with the disciplined steps of drill teams, parades, and military units, the march. In a move that wasn't particularly inspired, George chose the most popular one at the time, the aggressively catchy earworm, Colonel Bogey March. As the tune was also commonly whistled, its pairing with a room full of twittering birds felt preordained. The tune had been penned by Lieutenant F.J. Ricketts in 1914, who'd likely been inspired by a fellow officer and golfing colleague who whistled a similar melody as a way to warn fellow players of an incoming ball. By World War II, the well-known march, having been supplied with biting lyrics, loudly disclosing the vital twin organs Adolf Hitler had only one of, became the new unofficial national anthem of the British Commonwealth. Back in the States, Major Dorothy Nielsen of the U.S. Women's Army Corps attached considerably less risque lyrics to the march in 1943, where it became the organization's central rallying cry for years to come. In 1951, at a tech conference in Australia, Colonel Bogey March would become the first music ever played by a computer. At the time George Bruns chose the march for inclusion in the Enchanted Tiki Room, the tune was being whistled by virtually every American capable of doing so, having freshly saturated the national zeitgeist by way of the 1957 David Lean masterpiece and Best Picture winner, Bridge Over the River Kwai. In that World War II drama, which centered on a unit of British prisoner of wars at a Japanese prison camp, the captured soldiers whistled the tune on arrival. English composer Malcolm Arnold added a catchy countermarch for the film, which, as recorded by Mitch Miller, quickly climbed the Billboard charts in 1958. By the 1970s, a generation of puerile grade schoolers were singing a revamped version of the tune, gleefully describing the adverse effects of ingesting a popular kitchen cleanser. Spoiler alert, it makes you vomit. It wouldn't be the first time the tune had been earmarked for a Disney project. Director David Swift had woven the march into the Haley Mills comedy The Parent Trap in 1961, just a year before George chose it for the Tiki Room. In that film, the girls of Miss Inch's summer camp whistle the tune while marching lakeside. It's telling that only a month after, George recorded the minute-long Gene von Hallberg-arranged Bogey March, a new march was chosen to replace it. There were several reasons for its quick demise, not the least of which that, with its inclusion, elements of a Disneyland attraction would again be tied to the popularity of a rival studio production. It also didn't help that the march was inextricably linked to both a brutal war epic and an offensive British battle anthem. By far the most compelling reason for its removal was that Disney Productions already had a perfectly suitable march of their own, allowing WED executives to forego payment of yet another onerous licensing fee. Let's All Sing Like the Birdies Sing and Johnny Noble's revamped Hawaiian war chant had already required the fee's payment, with more due in the coming years. As can be imagined, avoiding the addition of another payee was a welcome byproduct of the bogey replacement. The newly chosen march would be none other than the Frank Churchill Larry Morey Hi-Ho from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which the famous septet sang while tramping home from work. The Tiki Room version would incorporate refashioned lyrics designed to aid and abet the speedy ouster of Tiki Room guests. In a marked shift in tone that bordered on the discourteous, the once bubbly cast now implored guests to keep marching in a row, step lively, and go take a ride. The refreshed song's music was recorded at the end of December 1962, and the vocals 2 weeks later. Other than the excision of an opening drum roll and the closing cymbal crash, the Tiki Room's new hi-ho was a lock. 4 months after the seats inside the Tiki Room were rearranged, Walt approved the cancellation of the Stouffer's Foods contract, then only 8 months in. No time was wasted in switching out restaurant signage. The prominent Stouffer's logo above the Tahitian terrace replaced with Adventureland overnight. Signage for the Enchanted Tiki Room, having always been planned to lead with the Stouffer's logo, was also rethought, allowing for Walt Disney's name to take its place. The show's updated marquee, announcing Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room, arrived at the last minute, having been designed and installed above the room's entrance doors just days before the attraction debuted. The sign's unveiling coincided with a last-minute tweak of the show's script as well, with the first avian host now welcoming guests to a room unambiguously belonging to Walt. Since its inception, the project had been called Birds, Bird Symphony, Bird Room, Bird Cafe, Bird Restaurant, Tropical Restaurant, Polynesian Restaurant, Polynesian Terrace, Tiki Birds, Tiki Room, Legend of the Enchanted Tiki and Bird Room, and Stouffer's Enchanted Tiki and Bird Room. From that point forward, there would be no more confusion. What was most noteworthy about Walt affixing his name to the show was that it marked the first time it had ever been attached to an attraction at Disneyland, with many more instances to follow. No doubt his insistence that his name headline each of the 4 exhibits WED was then developing for the 1964 World's Fair played a part in the decision. The signage tweak was significant for several other reasons as well. As the show had been wholly bankrolled with Walt's own money, the inclusion of his name in the title was more than earned, an effort that reflected an involvement considerably more personal than most of the projects Walt was involved in at the time. Additionally, with the Disney brand having reached a pinnacle in name recognition by the 1960s, Walt was confident that his name alone was sufficient to sell a new show at Disneyland. Perhaps the biggest clue to Walt's heightened focus on name recognition related to changes afoot at a modest eatery overlooking the rivers of America at Disneyland. Installation of the Tiki Room sign coincided with the dissolution of a 5-year contract the park held with Don DeFore's Silver Banjo Barbecue Restaurant in Frontierland, the only Disneyland establishment whose title bore the name of a living non-fiction personality other than Walt. Don DeFore was a beloved TV and film personality at the time, best known for his role as Thorny in the 1950s television series Ozzie and Harriet, and George Baxter in 1960's Hazel. Don had struck up a friendship with Walt after he had successfully secured a deal with NBC to televise the Emmy Awards for the first time in 1955, the same network that produced Hazel. Don was then president of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences and had accomplished something Walt had been trying to do for years when he was a member of the Academy's negotiating committee. With the launch of a yearly Emmy Awards broadcast, Walt knew his television projects would soon gain a level of recognition he felt they'd long deserved. As far as Walt was concerned, Don's breakthrough deal was nothing less than heroic, and once he offered Don his congratulations, the two became fast friends. Henceforth, Don and his family became eager participants in the opening day festivities at Disneyland. When a space opened up in Frontierland for a new eatery, Walt graciously offered it up to Don, who had made a name for himself cooking his way through a 3-year scholarship at the Pasadena Playhouse School of Theater throughout the 1930s. Managed by his brother Vern and proudly headlined by Don, the barbecue restaurant, serving sandwiches, ribs, and chicken, became a favorite haunt of Walt's, who enjoyed sitting outside with Don and his family while taking in views of the Mark Twain riverboat as it passed by. With the mounting success of Disneyland, however, Don's eye-catching moniker, emblazoned over the restaurant's entrance as well as the trademark silver banjo beneath it, increasingly came off as an ill-advised attempt to pull focus from the park's founder. No doubt Walt felt the pinch. By the early 1960s, efforts to purge the park of any outside branding that might dilute the Disney name gained urgency. With plans to expand Aunt Jemima's Pancake House next door, a character that, though fictional, would also disappear from Disneyland in 1970, and a well-timed letter from the Orange County Health Department citing insufficient kitchen space, Don's restaurant closed just a few months shy of the formal termination of his lease. The separation was a friendly one. Vern DeFore went on to manage several food venues at the park while Don retained close familial ties with Walt. His children came away with fond memories of the many days they spent tearing through the park free of charge during their father's restaurant reign, with Disney Studios archivist Dave Smith reminding Don's son Ron of the unique relationship his father had with Walt. "Your dad must have been really close to Walt," he noted, "to allow your dad to have his name on the restaurant." By all accounts, Disney's dissolution of the Stouffer's lease was also an amicable divorce. Neither Vernon nor Disney were reaping any rewards from the partnership, with WED chief executive Richard Irvine noting that the Pavilion and Terrace complex had operated at a loss for a year, and it was terrible, an awful operation for the park. The separation would mark the starting point for Disneyland's move toward managing all of their own food service operations henceforth. Along with the restaurant tables, the restaurant Muzak was also thrown to the curb. Luckily, George Brunn's effort wasn't a complete wash, as the 12 tracks he'd produced, arranged, and conducted 6 months prior found new life in an album titled Moonlight Time in Old Hawaii, which Vault Records released in 1969. The LP's title track had already made a solo appearance at the 1964 World's Fair, where it accompanied the Ford Pavilion's International Gardens display. By 1971, Moonlight Time, along with several other album cuts, were included on a loop of exotic music played throughout Adventureland at Walt Disney's Magic Kingdom in Florida. As for the restaurant tables, they enjoyed a new lease on life as well. Though the Tahitian Terrace next door already had secured their own furniture, additional space was found to host many of the Tiki Room's orphaned tables. With the remaining restaurant chairs now facing the center of the room, John Hench noted that the waist-high coffee station marking the spot and topped with a modest water feature offered a valuable opportunity to dress up the show. He had featured the centerpiece in his initial concept sketch, piled high with brightly lit pineapples, and bottom lit to spotlight the birdmobile above. George Bruns had written his opening barcarolle with a central dancing water fountain in mind, and for quite some time Roger Brogy's engineering team had been trying and failing to propel the fountain's central jet 8 to 10 feet toward the ceiling to initiate the dramatic descent of the birdmobile. Now that the coffee station was unequivocally the show's focal point, John Hench knew that a showier water feature was crucial. No longer of any practical use, the station's 4 inset cabinets, previously intended for restaurant storage, weren't particularly eye-catching or theatrical, despite the colorful tiki mask carved into each corner. As the station was also situated directly beneath the unfurling birdmobile, a huge amount of creative foresight wasn't necessary to imagine a far more colorful kinetic water feature taking its place. Sketches followed revealing a nearly 6-foot-tall ornate fountain, its large circular basin sitting atop the heads of 4 stylized bird totems. John imagined the new fountain with its own unique silhouette, which, if approved, would necessitate the removal of the coffee station. Fortunately, the station and attached tropical carvings found a second life as the fountain's outer perimeter. Once final paint and aging effects were applied, both elements blended seamlessly. As for interior cabinets, they would never see a stack of dinner napkins, mugs, or cutlery fill their shelves. Along with the bench seating against the back walls and the repurposed dining room chairs, soon to be soldered together into neat rows, the coffee station would soon become one of the few interior features that would remain from the Tiki Room's restaurant days. As was typical of virtually every creative spark under Walt's jurisdiction, the fountain idea kept evolving. John had already met with an engineer to review his sketch of the water effect he was after, and was told what Brogy's team already knew. It couldn't be done. Halfway up, the column of water would break apart and splash across the first couple of rows of theater guests. Undeterred, John approached Brogy in person with a proposal just crazy enough that it might actually work. I asked Roger Brogy if the water could be lifted in a hollow glass tube that would rise from inside the fountain at the right moment. He said yes, if we have a hole deep enough to recess the tube and a lifting machine. Luckily, the Tiki Room's studio mock-up on Stage 3, which sat atop the enormous, empty 20,000 Leagues pool, as well as the show's basement in Anaheim, were large enough to accommodate the ample length of tubing. Walt quickly signed off on the additional expense, and Roger moved forward on the engineering. "So we did it," John declared. "The overflowing water hid the glass tube perfectly." The effect would come to be recognized as one of the show's most spellbinding magic tricks. Adjusting to the room's latest mandate, John admitted that the augmented new fountain was a visually stunning stroke of showmanship. In time, Disney brass would proudly promote it as the Enchanted Fountain, acknowledging that it had become a distinct character unto itself. It wouldn't be the last. Where once a guest vantage point had been limited to the placement of their dining tables, now every seat faced forward, making it even more apparent that a single MC roosting in a single alcove wasn't enough. Confident that the room's new configuration allowed him the freedom to coax out the wacky, free-for-all musical comedy hidden within, Wally and his team of writers moved forward on fulfilling the central space with 3 additional MCs. By mid-December 1962, just 2 months after Walt nixed the restaurant, Wally released a brand new script that finally gave rise to the iconic multicultural foursome that would hold sway over the show for decades to come. Their job, as Walt saw it, would be to keep the show rolling. Wally's original Spanish macaw, now named Jose Carioca, and modeled after the same parrot Walt introduced in the 1942 package film Saludos Amigos, joined up with birds Fritz from Germany, Pierre from France, and Paddy, later Michael, from Ireland. How these 3 additional tropical birds from Europe ended up hosting a show on a Polynesian island was anybody's guess. Subsequent fans of the show would forever mull over the conundrum, noting that macaws weren't even native to Polynesia, their natural habitats being South and Central America. Though Wally's casting was all in good fun, the MC's distinct accents did serve at least one useful purpose. As each shared identical molds, separate and unique dialects were a useful tool for conveying character. Once installed distinctive coloring, slightly different perch silhouettes, and the addition of nameplates would be the only other attributes setting them apart, though Pierre was allowed the addition of half-shut eyelids to suggest a Gaelic snootiness. It's also possible that the decision to add European accents to the remaining trio was triggered by Fulton Burley's wish to share a vocal credit alongside Wally's, who had already assumed the role of Jose. As the saloon's new Irish tenor, Fulton's alignment to a macaw sharing the same accent was an easy sell. Though he was a master of up to 30 dialects, his renditions of songs such as Dear Old Donegal or Clancy Lowered the Boom back at the Horseshoe forever linked him to all things Irish. Though it's natural to assume Jose was always the first bird to speak words, Wally's December 1962 script opened with Fulton's Irish macaw. Though it was a charitable decision, it didn't last very long. A month later, Jose replaced Michael as the starting line, most likely due to the comic value of following the voice of a tropical native with an Irish brogue. The adjustment would be one of multitudes to follow. Though the decision to add 3 additional ringleaders was fortuitous, Wally's December script revealed a number of missteps. As messy as it was, however, the effort would prove to be incredibly useful. By clarifying what not to do with these characters, what to do with them became clearer than ever. Irish. Top of the morning to you, my fine feathered friends, and the rest of the day to meself. I don't like to be accused of being a braggart, but I do think I have more guests in my own section than either of you buccos. German. Acta Lieber, you are completely mistaken. I have more guests than you. Spanish. Pardon me, senors. If you will count, you will find I have more seniors and senoritas. Dos, tres, cuatro, uno momento. Maybe I could trade 4 seniors for 1 senorita? French. Oui, I do have more pretty mademoiselles, and if everyone will keep quiet, I'd like to introduce the star of our show. German. Guten Tag, mein Herren. Spanish. Buenas noches, seniors and senoritas. Irish. Top of the morning to you, fine ladies and gentlemen. French. Mon amis, mon amis. I know we are all stars, but we are also master of ceremonies, the 4 Macarios. Spanish. Ole, 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 see, this is Jose Carioca in this corner. I just came here to pass a good time. I hope you did too. Mi amigo over there, who talks so funny strange with his arch and Liebers, his name is Fritz. German. Guten Tag, mein Herren. How wunderbar to have you aboard. Sure? Well, at least you're here somewhere. If you like what we do, don't applaud. Just throw bird seed. We don't work for a chicken feed. French. And my name is Pierre. If you take a look at my profile, you'll see why they asked me to be in the show. They have me here for the ladies. Ah, my chérie, what are you doing after the show? Excuse-moi, I've forgotten myself. Irish. If I could have your sweet attention over here. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Michael, but all you lovely people can call me Mike, and I do want to welcome you to Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room and to all the strange and wonderful things that happen in the tropical isles of the Pacific where fantasy and legend walk hand in hand with tiki talk. Now, we'd like you to sit back and relax while we surround you with a world of joyous songs and wondrous miracles. Lights go out. Spanish. Oh, someone forgot to pay the light bill. Others. Shh. Those familiar with the final show will instantly be aware of multiple concerns. First on the docket was Wally's choice to name the Spanish bird Jose Carioca after the character Walt Disney introduced in Saludos Amigos, the studio's 1943 anthology celebrating all things South America. Based on the iconic Brazilian parrot or papagayo that Walt noted during his related Goodwill tour and later drawn up by Rio de Janeiro illustrator and cartoonist J. Carlos Jose, was a distillation of the cocky, freewheeling, and friendly Brazilian malandros, or rascal. He was also the perfect foil for Donald Duck, calm and conciliatory, where Donald was hair-trigger and impulsive. Wally's choice of an exaggerated Mexican accent for Jose, not far removed from Alfonso Bedoya's reading of "We Don't Need No Stinking Badges," from the 1948 classic The Treasure of Sierra Madre, or the various stage and screen characterizations of Sancho Panza from the 17th century novel Don Quixote, was nothing like the suave and refined reading that voice actor and musician Jose Oliveira produced for Jose Carioca. It also didn't help that Jose Carioca's name was based on Oliveira's pseudonym Z. Carioca, with the word carioca specifically referring to a person born in Rio de Janeiro. If anything, the Jose that Wally Bogue imagined, as well as he saw himself playing, was closer to the trigger-happy Mexican rooster Panchito Pistoles, the third caballero, after Donald and Jose, from the subsequent 1945 film The Three Caballeros. It goes without saying that Jose was neither a rooster nor a cartoon carioca. The straw hat, vest, suit coat, tie, and umbrella associated with the parrot made no sense for the more naturalistic Tiki Room birds Walt insisted on. Jose could stay, Jose Carioca would have to go. Of greater concern in regard to Wally's early draft was Michael's reference to the top of the morning, followed by the yet unnamed German macaw's Guten Tag and Jose's Buenas noches. Perhaps this was just a tongue-in-cheek acknowledgement that, barring the creation of 3 separate show programs, none of the MCs would ever know what time of day it was. Referencing them all at once, however, only served to magnify, rather than alleviate the show's inherent contrivance. Later versions of the script would remove all reference to time of day. Walt's directive that nothing diminish the illusion that his birds were truly alive continued with the nixing of Pierre's uncomfortably self-aware introduction of himself and his colleagues as the Four Macadios. Though a clever pun, it also served to underscore the show's artificiality. It would have to go. In addition, despite the Tiki Room's foreseeable popularity, there was no guarantee that every run would enjoy full capacity. To begin this review with a spirited debate about who had the greater audience would invariably lead to moments of outright awkwardness when any section of the room remained empty. Michael and Fritz would appear as if they were hallucinating. Jose would count invisible guests, and Pierre would find himself calling out mademoiselles where only messieurs sat. It was an easy decision to make. In order to avoid coming off as complete imbeciles, the 4 MCs would henceforth play to the entire room at all times. Then there was the issue of perhaps a bit too much ogling from the male contingent, starting with Jose's wish that one of his colleagues trade 4 of their senoritas for 3 of his seniors, culminating in Pierre's vain acknowledgement that he was cast solely to attract pretty mademoiselles. It appeared the show's MCs were far more interested in leering at the ladies than hosting a musical review. Even in the early 1960s, when traditional gender roles were considered far more immutable than they are today, this one-track lechery Jose and the gang displayed came off as a bit gratuitous. As it related to the necessary elements required for building character and story under the Disney banner, Walt's insistence on good taste remained top of the list. Later versions of the script would be considerably more wholesome. By far the early draft's most problematic issue concerned the very tone of the show. Before the first number even began, the MCs had undergone 2 bouts of bickering, one regarding which of them had more guests, the other concerning who the true star of the show was. Playful or not, their repeated pecking on each other wasn't making for a particularly joyful introduction. Knowing where the MCs eventually landed, it's easy to imagine the discussions that followed, with Walt undoubtedly hammering home the idea that Disneyland was a refuge from conflict and chaos, and therefore not an appropriate place to witness a handful of self-involved macaws trying to one-up each other as emissaries from their respective countries. It also didn't help that they were proving themselves woefully inadequate ambassadors for world peace. Outside of the safe confines of Disneyland, the Cold War continued. It was important these guys set a good example. If nothing else, the smiles sculptor Blaine Gibson permanently baked into their beaks weren't conducive to expressing ill will. Was it any wonder that by the time the final script was delivered, just a month and a half later, each of the MCs was fully bonded in brotherly love, all conflict scrubbed clean away. In a sprightly opening, 243 words less than the earlier version's 367, care was taken to include Jose's unambiguous "mi amigo" for Michael, Michael's friendly characterization of Fritz as "you rascal you," and Pierre's heartfelt "mon ami" as volleyed back to Michael. In addition, Pierre politely insisted that the wolf whistle he threw out wasn't meant for the madame below, but was instead intended for his good friend Fritz, a gesture that also served to leaven whatever alpha male energy remained. As a final cherry on the cake, Michael would eventually introduce the balance of the bird cast as the Glee Club, assuring spectators that this was undeniably an ensemble of fine-feathered friends. Knowing how the show's final script touchdown reveals one last tempting supposition. Following Wally's initial 4MC pass, it's almost certain one particular question was tabled that provided all concerned the clearest roadmap forward. What exactly is the job of an MC? As related to the opening of the Tiki Room, the answer was simple: to welcome guests, introduce themselves, and quickly get the show rolling. By the time the script was complete, Jose, Pierre, Fritz, and Michael would do little else. The mandate laid down for the Tiki Room MCs was conspicuously echoed 9 years later in the very first lines of the Country Bear Jamboree, Disney's second audio animatronic musical review. Buff, one of the 3 animatronic trophy heads, barks out to the offstage MC, "Hey, Henry, what's holding you up? Let's get on with the show." Though rife with concerns, Wally's December script was anything but a wash. For starters, the decision to use interstitial material to glue numbers together was a lock, and the MC's banters as they introduced the Birdmobile would remain mostly intact. Wally also gave the chorus their celebrated names: Colette, Suzette, Mimi, Gigi, Fifi, and Josephine, now that they had been rewarded a loftier venue at the Folies Bergère. The decision to inscribe not only their names, but also the name of each of the MCs onto large cockle shells that would hang from their perches soon followed. Finally, despite the character of the MCs requiring some polishing, the choice to have 4 of them was a done deal and would prove to be one of the most iconic features of the attraction. By far the early script's most notable success, however, was the fact that it existed at all, ensuring that what was once a happening was now a full-on show. In an effort to further embellish the MC's performances, Roger Broggie set Jack Gladish to work engineering a mechanism that rotated each of their perches a quarter turn left and right from a central position, allowing them more direct engagement with the audience during the show. As the review continued to evolve, Walt remained optimistic, even giddy. However, with each test run, often in the presence of the studio's VIPs and personal guests, he became increasingly aware that one last vital element remained missing. Despite the inclusion of 4 wisecracking MCs and the decision to allow the remaining birds, flowers, and totems to sing words, much of the proceedings still revealed more questions than answers. What was this thing? What exactly was going on, and why? As Wally Bogue recalled Walt ruminating, "We're a bunch of birds putting on a show." What would the expectations of a paying audience be once gathered inside this peculiar thatched-covered room? What might confuse them, and what were they owed? Could anything be added that would quickly set the tone and clarify for guests precisely what kind of party they'd been invited to? The answer to all of it was yes, and Walt was already on it. Unbeknownst to Wally, and just after he'd completed the bickering bird version of the script, Walt called together additional studio personnel for yet another run-through in order to jumpstart the addition of one last ingredient he was confident would squash all remaining concerns. A masterstroke of showmanship. The subsequent amendment would do just that, and then some, precisely defining the joyous spirit, tone, and character of Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room for generations to come.
We're here today with Ken Bruce, who is the author of Before the Birds Sang Words, the story of the development of the Tiki Room. But one of the things that I like most about this book is that it's not just the story of the Tiki Room, but it's also the story of so many other things about America's obsession with Tiki pop culture, about Walt's interest with miniatures and wind-up wonders, and how all of these things together, along with some military technology, end up producing a very unique attraction at Disneyland in 1963. So welcome to our show.
I am so happy to be here. Thank you for having me on. Love your work and love what you do. And you did your research ended up in my book as well. So thank you for that. I appreciate.
Well, that's how it should all work. Like, there's no way that any one person can cover all of this. And so we all stand on each other's shoulders in many ways as we try to create new things. And I think that's lovely, actually.
Yeah, and you actually sent me down a really cool rabbit hole. So yeah, I loved it. It was, yeah, so great to be speaking with you.
So the story that you tell is the story of an evolution of Walt's vision through the Little Man Project and Disneylandia, and also the story of how American culture is moving towards much more leisure time in the 1960s than it had in the first half of the century.
Right.
And so tell me a little bit about, so in thinking about this, and if it was going to have a Disney Center, it seems like there's many paths you could have gone down to tell this story. You could have told this story by picking Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln or a number of other projects that are developed around the same time. Tell me about your interest in the Tiki Room and why you picked this as the framework for your book.
It was not accidental. I think the Tiki Room, by and large, is the most consequential attraction in theme park history. It not only changed the history of Disneyland, but it changed the trajectory of all sort of themed environments moving forward. It set the standard. Why was it the most consequential? Because it was the first automated show. It was the first sit-down, push-button, fully automated experience. It was one giant magic trick. In the context of Disneyland, it changed the tone of the place forever. Before Disneyland, I think before that attraction, the Disneyland we know and love wouldn't have been recognized. It was a completely different park. There were bits and pieces of a more humorous, more fantasy-like sensibility, but I would argue that the Enchanted Tiki Room and maybe one little set piece that had opened just previous, the elephant bathing pool that Mark Davis designed for the Jungle Cruise, opened a path forward for a Disneyland that now knew what it was. Yeah, there are so many different reasons why it's important. I think we like start with the Tiki Room rather than Lincoln or the World's Fair projects, which actually were being worked on just as just at
Mhm.
the tail end of the creation of the Tiki Room.
The Tiki
Um,
Room is also the moment where music begins to enter the park in important ways.
It was the first attraction first ticketed attraction that had its own theme song. The rest of the music, balance of the music was, classical or novelty songs that someone else had written outside the studio. But that was the first Disneyland attraction that had its own ticketed attraction that had its own opening number that was written for it. First attraction that Walt wanted his name on, which was an interesting choice because it was so late in the game. I think like only a week or two before the Tiki Room opened, the call went out that we want Walt's name on this, or Walt wanted his name on this. He was putting his name on all the attractions at the New York World's Fair, but it was a very, very personal attraction to Walt. His fingers are all on it, and it's one of those few remaining areas at the park that is pure Walt. I argue at the end of the book that if you really want to know Walt, sit in the Tiki Room because that's him through and through.
So the inclusion of Walt's name on the attraction happens at about the same time that Walt is about to sell WED back to Walt Disney Productions.
Mm.
Do you think there was some posturing in this about concerning about how much WED was worth in terms of when it was going to be bought out?
I didn't even think of that till you brought it up. Sure, maybe. I do know that Walt was chafing a little bit about Walt was chafing it at the idea of other people taking control of the. No one was about to take control of Disneyland. Disney is part of Disneyland. It was Disneyland itself was such a Walt thing. That was his baby and his park, and he loved it. But as far as things at the park that were uniquely Walt's, yeah, he wanted to make sure people knew that was his baby. Now, back at the studio, Walt Disney Presents is on everything. That's just marketing. But Disneyland was his own place, and this was him. This was him making an effort to say, "This is absolutely mine," for not only creative reasons, but because it was his money. He paid for that attraction.
Yeah,
He had to lease out the space, but he paid for that out of his own pocket.
I still think that is so incredible that various areas of the park, because that's true for the Mickey Mouse Club Circus as well. Walt
Yeah,
had to lease out space to make these
yeah,
plays
yeah.
happen under
So
his
He had to pay Disneyland Inc. a fee to lease out the space,
Mhm.
but he had to make sure that the money coming in for it, at least for the first year or so, was his. Yeah, because they had to. Yeah, that first year there was no sponsor for the attraction. It was it was a wed show, which was his company, and so forth. They had to split the book, so they had to make sure that the money paid that was paid for a ticket went to him and his company. That changed once they had their first sponsor, United Airlines, and also when WED was sucked up by the rest of the studio.
So it's been open now for a little over 60 years.
Yeah, 60 years, yeah.
How do you think that people understood? How do you think they processed this when they saw it back in the early 1960s?
Oh, how do I think? I know. Like you
Okay.
read first person, it was jaw dropping, and literally jaw dropping. I love that one out of the blue. What was it? I forget his name. A doctor. I think he was a doctor who wrote a paper about how experiencing the Tiki Room was like experiencing, the cathedrals of Europe. I get that. Context is everything, and that part of the fuel for writing the book was to remind people of what a breakthrough and revolutionary and jaw-dropping experience this was for first-time viewers. It was one magic trick after another, and early viewers just didn't know what they were watching. This all-enveloping, one surprise after another experience that felt like puppets with no strings. It was magic. It was, the use of the word enchanted, which was actually one of those words that came in late in the game too. That is the perfect word to use. People were literally enchanted by this, and the room really did feel enchanted. What kind of magic had this space, inherited? So yeah, writing the book was to remind people of how mind blowing that thing was in its day. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about what Polynesian culture was like in the late 50s and early 60s. And also, like, one of the things that I think is amazing about the Tiki Room is that alcohol is shunned in the park in 1963. But the Tiki Room takes a lot of its visual cues, I think, from Tiki bar culture of that time. And so it's inviting in the bar culture, but also not the drinks.
Yes, it was. The Tiki Room is the world's most elaborate and mind-blowing tiki bar that doesn't sell alcohol or anything. It was
At least
planned
so
as a
far.
it was planned as a restaurant. Yeah, who knows? Maybe they'll change that. Walt didn't believe in alcohol, and that's fine, but liberally stole. Like, the early sketches of the exterior and interior were nothing but pulling from that culture. They were going to have their own tropical hideaway, slash tiki room at Disneyland. It was time, especially on the heels of Hawaii becoming the latest state in the Union. That whole culture is a uniquely American invention, absolutely goofy and naive and loving. And we have to remember post-war America is suburbia, a lot of cement and a lot of sameness. And the idea of a place for dad, well, and lots of other people, to escape, to have a drink, to be a little naughty and risque and goofy and playful. Also, corporate America was, you wore a tie, you wear a suit, you fit in. In the tiki culture that America was dreaming up, that was thrown to the curb. No, you're on an exotic island. You can put that. The idea was you're escaping to something exotic and a little bit more permissive and less buttoned up. That caught on like wildfire. It had been building since the 30s, but really caught on post-war. Again, a lot of the GIs coming back, they were coming from the islands, and it was both a horrific experience for all of them, and also kind of magical as well. So yeah, the tiki culture was a way to express that, and it wasn't going to take long before there was going to be something at Disneyland that reflected that zany, wacky world. And it's sort of like crazy because Walt took the zany of it and ran with it. If you really think about it, the Tiki Room is a vaudeville burlesque mishmash that has kind of Monty Python vibes. It's just running into the weird, and it's embracing it wholeheartedly. So it was just a joyful space and a joyful show and a revolutionary space age masterwork. Yeah.
Could you talk about the space age-edness of this a little bit? And so 3 years earlier, we have Nature's Wonderland, which,
Yes.
and they use in the promotional materials, you mentioned this in the book too, they use
Yeah.
the term audio animatronics. I think it's the first time it gets used for a
Yes.
show because it pairs sound and movement. Could you describe how much animatronics change between 1960 and 1963 from when we have rams clashing their heads together next to the train tracks?
Right.
We have this nearly 20-minute show over in the Tiki Room.
Right. So the important thing to think about, okay, I'm gonna try to sum this up really quickly because it's fascinating. I really dug deep into what it all meant. There were two main patents, one after the other. And the first one was all of, well, okay, first of all, the mine train through Nature's Wonderland. All those figures were cam based. They're basically like clockwork. And some of them could be triggered when a train passed, but they're basically like you're winding something up and then it just plays. It's a clock. However, one of the first things that troubled them is like, well, we've got ravens on a tree and we've got a coyote in a cave, and we want to have them caw, and we want to have them yip, and we want to have their mouths match the noises that they're making. It's as simple as that. And the first patent for that is aligned with audio animatronics was literally taking the soundtrack of that bird chirp and finding a way to make that sound on audio tape move their mouth. It's as simple as that, but it was a big breakthrough. And they decided to call that audio animatronics. And if you think about it, audio literally means the sound of a coyote. That is the audio that they are talking about. They are not talking about the later blips and bleeps that you do not hear in the Enchanted Tiki Room. So they carved out the word audio animatronics to sell to sell the new tech at the mine train. None of the characters in the mine train, other than their mouths, was animated by sound. Then the Tiki Room comes, and they're like, "Well, this is going to be a 20-minute, 17-minute show where, well, wait, what?" The second patent was, what if sounds that we are not supposed to hear, blips and bleeps that have different audio wavelengths, what if those can animate the balance of everything else, from a head tilt of a bird to a lighting cue to a rotation on if we can do that, we can actually do a long show. Again, you're only seeing the characters on the train ride for seconds, so didn't need to be. So they were able to find, with the help of our lovely Defense Department, a means to do that, and so they were able to buy that patent. The government was done with it. They were like, we're onto something better, so they were able to buy that tech. Hence, new patent, Audio Animatronics 2.0, I will call it, that allowed for blips and bleeps to trigger all the additional movements in a show. And that was the big breakthrough for audio animatronics. There were plenty of limitations even in the Tiki Room show, which had to be worked out, and were worked out fast. The complexity grew, but the one thing that propelled audio animatronics to even greater heights was other people's money. And that was the fair. Walt was thrilled to be using other people's money to do all the R&D that would eventually infuse Disneyland and bring it to the next level. So there you go.
I'm just in awe of how quickly this all happens. I talked with Jack Gladish just before the pandemic, spent a couple days with him, and kind of went through like how Elements of Lincoln's Head was put together.
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's just stunning, like with the technology that they had at that time, and this really like what I think is like this really limited Polaris system where they're recording movement and audio together, that they're able to put together very sophisticated shows. Like those cam effects that you're talking about earlier. I don't know what a long cam effect cycle would be, maybe 30 seconds, maybe not even that.
I think, yeah, I timed it. I think it's about 30 seconds. Yeah.
30 seconds. Yeah.
We have to remember too, you think of Pirates of the Caribbean or the Haunted Mansion as audio animatronics extravaganzas, and they're not. Most of that stuff is cam based. It's or was. It's long been digitized, but it's still just repeating movement. In fact, if you listen to, I think it's about 30 seconds. If you pull out your like Pirates of the Caribbean album and you listen to the actual audio set pieces, they're all exactly the same length.
Mm-hmm.
And that was based on the ability of the cams. Like the cams had they're all the same size, and they could provide, I think it was about 30 seconds of a section of a show. And then they just rotate and rotate and rotate along with the audio.
They go from that to a nearly 20-minute show in 3 years, which is just, I think,
right.
It controls multiple characters and lighting cues and audio and special effects. And it's just stunning because right now it's taken 4.5 years to redo Communicore Hall at Epcot, where they develop an entirely new technology that drives multiple shows for years.
Yes.
At the time in the early 60s.
I was like, the show, the Tiki Room show's tech looking back was very, very, very old school. And yet at the same time, brilliant, just brilliant. Like, and still like, and even then you could look at a cam-based figure from the 1800s, sold in a French store back in 1899 and still revel about how clever it is. People are still trying to figure out how they even did that. Old school, but still amazing. And how they take, even the Disneys took limitations. The most sophisticated birds, they have like 5 different movements, but in the hands of, say, a really good animator like Exitensio, you could do really interesting things with those limitations. So it's exploiting your limitations, and that was a good example of that at the Tiki Room.
Fans are deeply possessive of this attraction. And if you were to try, they've shortened the Tiki Room some since 1963. But if you were to try to change it like they did in Florida, fans kind of rise up against it. Whereas other similar attractions go through changes and they're just kind of accepted. Country Bear has had 3 incarnations and it soon will have a 4th in Florida. And, there might be some minor grumblings, but nothing like that happened during
Yeah.
new management in Florida when the Tiki Room was taken over with a new show. Why do you think that fans are so possessive or protective of the Tiki Room?
Hopefully for the same reason that I am. It's so personal to Walt that this was a very personal show to Walt. Other shows like Carousel of Progress and some of Pirates and other things are personal as well, but I don't think equally. Walt built the Tiki Room from the ground up. The moment the idea of putting mechanical birds in that space came to be, he was on it. And again, my book, so much of my book is the shoe leather that leads up to why that lit him up. It was like, this can work and we can do this. I know it can work. And then the whole show built upon that. Oh, you can do that? Well, can you do this? You can do that. Can we do this? The thing just exploded into this just wackadoodle, cuckoo crazy that Walt had to pull back towards the end because it was just getting too extravagant for all the right reasons. So the answer to that is, I think the fans know what I know, which is you screw with it too much and you are defacing a beautiful painting. The powers that be will always remind you Disneyland is not a museum. However, the Enchanted Tiki Room has made it has earned its place in one. It's that important. So to screw with it is to screw with a painting by a great master named Walt Disney. It's why we don't go into. Walt loved the idea of being able to change his park, but Walt's not here anymore. So it's nice to have something in the park that remains forever a celebration of Walt and his sensibilities, and his creative spirit. That's his baby. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book. I wanted to remind people of why this thing is a masterwork and why reverence should be paid.
So the book is absolutely fabulous. It's deeply
Thank you.
It has stories that I haven't heard before. It synthesizes the development of a complex attraction, but it does it against the national landscape and against the evolving world that Walt is building for himself. Beautifully done all the way through.
Oh, thank you. Coming from you, that means a lot. Your work is exemplary, so to get that from you is really lovely.
The book, Before the Birds Sang Words by Ken Bruce, is available right now in hardcover on Amazon. I'm pretty sure that it is the most comprehensive exploration of how a single Disney attraction was developed ever written. I'll be back next week with a new show. The plan right now is to take a look at the updates to Fantasmic that will debut at Disneyland this coming Friday, along with the show's interesting and at times troubled history. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.